Greetings everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Sitrep podcast channel, your forward operations base for all things military and historical wargaming. I am your host, Oriskany Jim, and today I thought I would try something just a little different. I thought maybe we could take a look at a classic wargame from the 1980s, one of my all-time favorites, and believe it or not, it's not Panzerleader. People who watch our channel probably know that Panzerleader is probably my favorite wargame system of all time, but today we're talking about the one game that just maybe might have nudged Panzerleader out of its place in my heart. We're talking about Assault by Game Designers Workshop. That's Games Designers Workshop, not Games Workshop, so don't get excited, you pervs. Okay, you're not pervs because you like GW games, you're pervs because you want me to review a GW game. Clearly you're into pain. Painful for you, painful for me, painful in ways that are, shall we say, less than healthy. There might be something amiss in the old brain box there, you may want to get that checked out. But in all seriousness, Assault was a series of war games that was designed by Game Designers Workshop, came out in the mid and late 1980s, and Assault itself, of course, was the flagship of that series. Assault was designed by the absolute legend Frank Chadwick, along with development by John Harshman and John Astle. It's a hex and counter game at the platoon level, so each unit in the game represents a platoon, a battery, or a section. The hexes are 250 meters across, each turn is about 5 minutes of battlefield time, and this is modern, or at least modernish warfare, so a lot happens in those 5 minutes, trust me. So, long story short, take your first shot. Assault is, very basically speaking, a Panzerleader type game. It's at the command tactical level, so your average scenario will put an American task force, that's either a tank or mech infantry heavy, sort of a reinforced battalion, up against a Soviet regiment or maybe even a brigade, organized along the operational maneuver group lines that we used to see in the mid-1980s. The game is chunky, I'm not gonna lie. Even the relatively modest scenario I just described, which is smaller than most Panzerleader scenarios, is gonna run you about 4 hours. Of course, there's a lot more going on in 1980s combat. For starters, you have anti-tank guided weapons. In this era, we're talking about mostly the American TOW and the Soviet AT-5 Spandrel. Infantry have their own attack weapons, like the RPG-7 in this era and the M47 Dragon, along with all kinds of helicopters. You have scouts, attack gunships, troop ships. These are all a thing, especially once you get into the Boots and Saddles expansion set that I'll cover in just a little bit. So let me go through just a few aspects of the game. I'll talk about things that I like and things I don't like. Just please remember that when I'm talking about things I don't like, it comes from a place of love. I often joke that I'm going to be buried in my casket with a box of Panzerleader, and yet I could still, on the fly, unscripted, put out a 2-hour video of everything I absolutely hate about that game. So when I'm talking about some of the drawbacks of the Assault series by GDW, again, this is the one game that just might have replaced Panzerleader as my all-time favorite. So again, here is the box set. Once again, I actually got lucky and picked this up for a hell of a good deal at Historicon in 2019. The box is completely intact. In fact, I also got lucky because, again, I don't think it comes like this normally, so watch out. But this particular box came with the Reinforcements expansion set already in this box. So here is the rules booklet. As you can see, it's not very thick, but these rules are dense, okay? This game kind of assumes that you're familiar with some of the fundamentals of hex and counter gaming or command tactical gaming, and yeah, there's a lot of information to go through with this. There's also a briefing booklet. There's no rules in here, but it gives you a lot more background and context. I won't say historical background because, again, 1980s, Warsaw Pact versus NATO never happened, but it goes into a lot more detail about the equipment, training, and doctrine by which these armies were actually built. Again, this is a hex and counter game. It doesn't care about what toys that you have built and painted to put on your table. This game strictly goes by the actual tables of organization, equipment, and orders of battle used by the opposing armies in the mid-1980s. Okay everybody, quick time warp from the future. Greetings from future editor Oriskany. I forgot to talk about some of the other components that come with this game. Alright, so starting off, we do have some additional charts. I know that charts sometimes get on people's nerves. Please don't let that put you off of GDW Assault. The charts are laid out like this just to, again, make everything easy for you. You don't have any stat lines, you don't have any unit cards, you don't have to look up any rules in a rule book. It's all right there on the chart, and you look it up and you're good to go. Here's a great example. I'm not sure how legible this is going to be. These are some of the organization charts you have for Soviet forces. Here's some more for U.S. forces. You don't have to read a bunch of books to learn how in 1985 an actual U.S. armor tank team was put together, or a mechanized team, or a mechanized company, or a task force, a tank heavy or a mech heavy task force. You don't have to talk about Soviet operational maneuver groups. You don't have to learn any of that stuff. You literally just pick out the counters, and these charts are sized to the same size as the counters. You literally just match them up, and when you get all the boxes filled in, you know that you're ready to play. It's that simple. Here are the terrain charts. Again, very bright, very clear, very well put together. Although, to be honest, this terrain elevation resolution chart down here, I think I've had to consult this maybe twice in my entire assault career. This is just for very, very tricky terrain questions. Normally, the terrain elevation rules are very, very straightforward. Again, this chart just helps you out if you run across a really sticky situation. Say you're trying to target a Soviet platoon 12 hexes away. He's on a level 2 hill, you're on a level 4 hill, but there's a level 3 hill between you two. How close is it to you versus how close is it to him? Little tricky bits like that. Again, you hardly ever use it. Maybe it's once in a blue moon, but it's there just in case you need it. The next thing to talk about are some of the maps in GDW Assault. They're gorgeously drawn, and they are very, very clear. There are no questions on these maps, if you guys know what I'm talking about. Now, it's not just on paper, but it is thick paper. However, this might be the kind of game, I don't know, maybe you want to put under a sheet of plexiglass, or maybe carefully put some glue tack underneath the corners. Either way, you'll be fine. And oh look, check it out, they even give you one of these old-time style D10s from the 1980s. The kind that you would have to either scribble in with a chalk or a crayon or a colored pencil, something like that. Good God, look at the corners on that thing. Jeez, you wouldn't want to step on that on the floor in the middle of the night, say on your 7th or 8th trip to the bathroom. What? And finally, we come to the unit counters. Now, I do have some extra counter sheets, so if you pick up this box set, you may not get all of these, but because I also have the reinforcements pack. But yeah, the counters, again, I still have them all on the sheet, so everything's good to go. I have a completely intact set. We got American and Soviet counters. Again, this does include the reinforcements package. Now, I know what you're gonna say, everybody, okay? Oriskany, you said this is one of your favorite games of all time. Why are all the counters still in the counter sheets? Why haven't you even punched the game? Alright, look, this is like my keeper or my display kit. This is also a game that I played very heavily back in the 80s and 90s, out of high school, into the military, and a little bit beyond. But to be honest, I've had a tough time with opponents for this game. Also, as subscribers to the Sitrep podcast will tell you, most of the games that we feature here are virtualized. So with electronic counters, your physical counters get to stay unpunched in the counter sheet. Okay, so let's get into a few of the basics about how this game actually works. First up, we have the scenario sheets, which again look, pretty standard. You have the map layout, which way the wind's blowing, some of the objectives, things like that. However, do notice that both sides get their own briefing sheets. The Americans and the Soviets get separate information for each scenario. There are only 3 scenarios that come in the starter box, which doesn't sound like a lot, but don't be fooled. Each one of those 3 scenarios has 6 force levels for both sides. And what you do is, before the scenario starts, you either blind draw out of a cup some counters, or you roll a dice. Either way, though, you do not show your opponent what you drew or what you rolled. And each one of those force levels is a wildly different actual composition for your formation in the game. So you could start off with a small scouting force with a really big victory point bonus modifier. Smaller units get a victory point bonus. Or a big spearhead assault force that gets a very small or even a penalty negative victory point modifier. The point is, either way, your opponent has no friggin' idea what he's going up against. And oh yeah, spoiler alert, neither do you. And this game also has some pretty wicked hidden movement rules. Suffice it to say, the fog of war is strong with this one. Now, this is something of a pain in the ass when you're trying to teach a new player this game, because, again, you can't see each other's forces, and this poor guy trying to learn the game doesn't even know how to pick his own units out of the box to set up his force. But once you get a good scenario going, and once you get a solid player, virtually every game of GDW Assault is a double-blind game, which is just awesome. The second neat thing you'll notice about a game of GDW Assault is how units are placed on the map. You don't just stack up counters into the hex grid like you do in Panzerleader. Here, the precise placement of the counter in the hex grid designates the units facing. Yes, units have facing in this game, which is especially important for armored units. There's front armor, side armor, things like that. This is going to make a big difference, of course, when it comes to whether or not you survive when you start taking incoming fire. Unit placement within the hex also designates the unit's formation. Please remember, Assault is a command tactical game where even a single counter represents at least a platoon, battery, or section. So that single Abrams counter actually represents 4 Abrams battle tanks. How are they set up within that hex? Well, you basically have two choices. You can either have your units set up in road march or combat formation. Think of it as sort of a column or online formation in a linear combat game. If the top of your unit is facing the flat side of a hex, that designates that your unit is in column or road march formation. It's much faster, it's much more maneuverable. However, it can't actually fight, it can't shoot at anybody, it can't bring all its weapons to bear, and its flanks are wide open. I mean, just picture a column of APCs stretched out along a highway. When the top of your counter is facing the spine or point of a hex, that designates that the unit is in combat formation or is online and ready to fight. It can actually engage enemy targets now, its flanks are much less exposed, and for units that actually have to worry about a forward firing arc, again, the unit placement within the hex grid sets that up for you as well. I'll admit this does lead to another small potential issue when it comes to playing GDW Assault. The game is pretty finicky about how units are placed in the hex. You gotta stay right on top of it, you gotta make sure everything is very, very clearly placed, and you gotta stay on top of your opponent to also make sure that every unit, you know exactly what formation it's in and which way it's facing, because it does make a difference. This also is not one of those games where you can casually bump the table and nudge some of the units around. Here's another thing to remember about how you put your units on the map in a game of GDW Assault. In most scenarios, virtually every single counter starts off inverted. So again, here is one of the Soviet counter sheets. It looks pretty standard. You have your tank silhouette or your infantry section. You have some of the combat values, a designation, but on the back are just arrows. Now these arrows can be used to show which way, again, the unit is facing, which way it's oriented. That shows unit facing and direction and also its formation, but your opponent has no idea what the hell these things are. So again, per the force level scenarios I described earlier, not only do you not know what exactly your opponent has, but you don't know which of his units are where because they all look the same until you either spot them or they open fire on you. This gets especially hairy when you start looking at these. These Ds you see here, these are dummy units. A lot of times the scenario is going to give you a certain amount of dummy units, and if you are cagey and careful with the way you play your dummy units, man, you can really get into some psychological warfare and get inside your opponent's head. We're talking about bluffs and feints and forcing your opponent to respond to assaults that aren't actually there or to assault positions that you're not holding. Okay, so the combat system for GDW Assault, especially between armored fighting vehicles, is a little unusual for a command tactical game. Normally in these unit-based games, there isn't usually a roll to hit. You just apply a certain volume of fire against a certain target in a certain terrain and a certain range. You factor in some modifiers. You go to a combat results table, you roll a dice, and boom, there you have it. Here in GDW Assault, there is actually a roll to hit, especially between armored fighting vehicles. So you find, hopefully that's at least a little legible there, you find your unit that you're trying to fire at the enemy, you pick out what ammunition sort that you want to shoot at the enemy, you get the range, and that first number there is your chance to hit on a D10. This is one of those weird games that you have to roll on or under a given target number. Low rolls are best. Once you score a hit, the next step is seeing whether or not you penetrate the enemy's armor. There is an armor value for each ammunition type at each different range, so assuming that you've scored a hit, all you do is you take your penetration value, you subtract the enemy's armor, and that delta is again your chance to get on or below on a D10. If you score a penetration, you've now damaged that enemy unit. So we'll quickly switch over to the Soviet direct fire data chart here. You can see where each kind of tank has different choices of ammunition type, and they have different kinds of values for penetration and for accuracy that tend to drop off over range. Again, they drop off at different rates depending on what kind of ammunition and what kind of gun you have. Other weapons, like say anti-tank guided weapons, always have the same chance to hit and the same penetration. They're clearly rocket powered and they're guided missiles, although they do, interestingly, sometimes have minimum ranges as well. So again, looking at these direct fire data charts, it's pretty clear that Assault brings in a fair amount of ballistic detail into the game. It looks complicated, or maybe it doesn't. Trust me, it's not. Once you get used to it, it runs super fast. And honestly, it's kind of important because, let's face it, in the mid-1980s and into the late 1980s, you've basically got two tank guns in Europe. You've got some flavor of a NATO 120mm gun, and you've got a Warsaw Pact 125. That's about it. So by bringing in different ammunition types, Assault sort of brings some of that flavor back into the game. Assault also features another key element that is definitely lacking in any Panzerleader game, an actual command and control system. Imagine that. So you have a certain number of command points that you can spend each turn to activate or fire your units. These are generated by your actual headquarters units, your TOCs, like say the American M557 Tactical Operations Center, or offboard units like say Division or Brigade headquarters. If you don't have the command points to activate all your units just aren't moving. That's especially troublesome for the Soviets, who almost always have more units than the NATO player and much fewer command points. Now, the Soviet player can mitigate this shortfall by either moving their units per what they call Soviet drill rules, or by moving all their units in certain blocks. This encourages the Soviet player to adopt Warsaw Pact-like tactics without forcing him to do so with top-down straitjacket rules. Headquarters and TOC units can also plan, and that is build up command points for future turns. So you can sort of lay a trap for your enemy, especially if you're in a sort of a defensive posture where you're building up more and more command points, and then when your enemy comes in range, you use them up all at once in this big grand counterattack. But this leads into some of the areas that honestly aren't so hot about the game. Between the command rules and the ammunition rules and the artillery rules and the morale rules, there is a fair amount of record keeping in this game. Okay, let's make that quite a bit of record keeping in this game. Now, my friends and I have certain ways to get around it. One of the things is we didn't quite use the full ammunition supply rules. We pretty much just said, look, you have unlimited ammunition except for your armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot, depleted uranium, like they call the silver bullet, like the best tank ammunition that a tank can carry. Okay, maybe you've got like 3 or 4 rounds of that. After that, ammunition is pretty much unlimited. There's also some things where, okay, your unit can only be commanded by its actual parent unit. The game counters are serialized, but there are ways around that where you can cross-attach certain subordinate units or constituent units into others' headquarters. That becomes something that they call cross-attachment rules. Again, that's more record-keeping. You can kind of jettison some of this to make the game run a little bit smoother if you want. This is just the kind of thing that puts some players off. Just remember that a lot of it is kind of optional. Another small issue is, with all of those force level scenario rules I talked about before and all the hidden movement rules, Assault is not a solitaire friendly game, like, at all. So there's that. It's also kind of tough, again, like I said before, to get a new player started. You're not allowed to see his units or even help him pick out his units, so it can be pretty tough to get a brand new player started right off the ground. And one last thing, and this is strictly an Oriskany Gym thing, so please don't let this put you off of GDW Assault. Assault is going to be a very tough game to virtualize. Subscribers to the channel know that just about all the games that we do here are played, long distance over some sort of virtual platform. Assault is not really friendly to that. So this is one of the reasons why you may not ever see it on the Sitrep podcast channel. But in order to end this video on a high note, let's go ahead and discuss the last kick-ass feature of the GDW Assault series. Yeah, it's a series. There's a whole range of awesome expansions and supplements you can get for this game. I already talked about the reinforcements package that I was lucky enough to find in my starter kit. Next up is Boots and Saddles, which gets into armored cavalry and air cavalry. Units go up to and including the dreaded AH-64 Apache gunship. Not fun when you're playing the Soviets, I can tell you from personal experience. I think I lost the better part of a tank regiment in under 2 turns in one scenario. Next, we have the Bundeswehr NATO Frontline box set, which of course brings in the West Germans, along with engineering rules and units for all the armies in Europe. Finally, we have Chieftain, British Army of the Rhine. This box set, of course, deals with the British, and all the units that you would have found there in the mid-1980s. So you have Chieftains, you have some of the early Challengers. This box set also includes a full set of units and counters for the Dutch army that you would have seen coming out of the Netherlands. So, there you have it, folks. GDW's Assault series is definitely a game for which you want to eat your Wheaties. But it really isn't that bad, at least at first. You can start off with the base set introductory rules, and then wade into additional levels of complexity as you feel comfortable. The tactical command realism that Assault brings to the table is really commendable. It not only discusses, but kind of enforces how NATO and Warsaw Pact armies were built and trained and deployed and equipped, how they really would have behaved on a prospective 1980s European battlefield. This is something that you frankly don't see in more recent game releases, and it's really kind of a shame. If you can find a box set, or even more so, find an opponent hardcore enough to go on this journey with you, Assault is definitely recommended as one of my all-time favorites, especially if you want to get some sort of idea of what a task force or battalion or regimental commander would really have to do in a 1980s Cold War gone hot in Europe. And that's all we have for today, folks. Thanks very much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. Please remember to hit that notification bell. Also, please consider joining the Sitrep Podcast Discord. There's an auto-accept invitation link to our Discord in the description of this video. Join our community, see what's going on, and best of all, show us what's happening on your hobby table. But for now, we are rounds complete for another episode of the Sitrep Podcast. I am your host, Oriskany, and as always, Tango Mike for watching.